Come on. Let's go. Come on. Place. Place. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of the Human Challenge. If you tuned in last week, you would have seen a lovely conversation with the wonderful Hero D. McKellies, the founder of the Lab of Meditation and a consultant for the United Nations Foundation Peace on Purpose project. We spoke a lot last week about the kind of proponents of and self-love, and that it really is about acceptance. And I think acceptance is really crucial to when we start getting into conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. If we all live from that space, we would also be able to, I think it would inform really how we create a lot of the structure of society and really what's around us. So today, we're going to continue that conversation with the wonderful Priya Sam, my great friend. I'm going to invite you here. Um,
Hi, Vanessa. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you perfectly. Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear
Okay,
you.
perfect.
I for some reason I can't turn my video on just yet.
Give me one quick sec. I had this issue the last time. I think I have to, let me press something for you. It'll just take a second. But in the meantime, Priya Sam, there we go, who I've just invited to video, will come on. Priya is a storytelling expert, keynote speaker, and consultant. She is also the host of the Turning Point podcast, which is actually how we met. I was very grateful to be able to have a wonderful conversation with Priya on her show. You can find it on its podcast as well. You can also find it on YouTube. But before starting the Turning Point, Priya was also a news anchor and a morning show host, originally in the East Coast. And then she moved to Toronto, where she anchored and co hosted CTV's national morning show, Your Morning, which I think is really, really exciting, because when we talk about things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, obviously, in the media landscape, there's been quite a bit happening on the diversity front. So, really excited to have you here. Outside of work, Priya is in a fitness class, usually planning an adventure. Every time I talk to Priya, she's like, I'm somewhere all over North America. It only makes me a little jealous, but she is literally, truthfully, always somewhere kind of exciting, or with her cats and a book. So there's lots of good balance with you,
All
Priya.
about balance.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for coming on the show. Priya is also the board member of the Be Human Foundation, which I'm very excited about because that is something that I launched and I'm very passionate about. And so I'm super honored that, Priya, that you were willing to be a part of that journey. And so thank you. Thank you so much for that. You can check out Priya at our website, priyasam.com, if you're looking for any of her keynote expertise, or even to learn more about her podcast. You can definitely check out her website for that. So, Priya, we are celebrating International Women's Day, and it's International Women's Month, super exciting. And, I know that with you being, a storyteller, expert, I was really, let's kind of talk about this a little bit. I kind of want to hear, you come from media, and so as we mentioned, right, the media is sort of going through this thing right now about diversity, and so maybe you can tell us a bit about your journey through that whole, your whole experience, and then maybe that can lead into a conversation of some of the challenges you experienced, and then maybe the importance of being able to share our stories in this way and from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my career in television in a small station on the east coast of Canada. And I would say, I think I had a similar experience to a lot of people starting out in that industry and in a lot of other industries where you're really trying to make your mark at the beginning. You're coming in on your days off, you're always saying yes to everything. And so I felt like I was kind of doing all the right things to really try and get a full-time job. So I worked part-time at the station. I was a newsroom assistant. So basically I answered phones, I printed scripts for the news anchors, and once in a while I would do a little bit of writing at the beginning, and I rolled the teleprompter as well. So those were kind of my main roles. And then I really wanted to be a reporter. So I would come in on my days off, and a lot of the reporters were very gracious. They would let me shadow them. I would put together kind of like my own version of their stories just to sort of get practice, and then ask for feedback from the producers that worked in the building. And eventually, after doing this for a little while, I got this opportunity to be on air for the first time. I got to fill in for a week. And so this station, I was actually the only, or there was actually one other person of color there at the time when I started. And that was it. So I felt I really, I think you really stand out in a lot of these situations, right? Especially when whether you're the only woman, the only person of color, the only person from the LGBTQ2 plus community, whatever it might be. And I think there's always this added pressure of you can't just be as good as everyone else. You have to be better. So not only did I feel like I had to work hard, I had to work harder than the people around me. So for example, I was coming in way more often on my days off, doing all of this sort of unpaid work than a lot of my white counterparts were. And at the time, I was really raised by immigrant parents who kind of instilled that in me, like, you're always going to have to work harder. So to me, I almost wasn't even thinking about it at the time. I just felt like it was what I had to do. So I did eventually get a full-time job after filling in for a little while. And I started to really feel a little more confident speaking up. So I can think of a few situations. For example, there was a story about a car accident, and we were talking about the race of the victim. And I was like, why are we talking about this? It's like not relevant to the story. Sometimes race is relevant and sometimes it's not. And in this case, I felt it wasn't. So I asked the question, why are we doing this? And was met with eye rolls and, oh, you're so sensitive about these things. And when you think about those kinds of interactions happening regularly, it really starts to take a toll, right? Like nobody would stand up with me. So then it really started to impact my confidence and make me feel like I shouldn't talk about these things and that my voice wasn't important because nobody else was seeing the value in it. So I thought that moving to a bigger city and a station with more diversity might change that. And that is, so I got this amazing opportunity to fill in for a year on a national morning show in Toronto. And I did have some very positive and wonderful experiences at that station, which I'm very grateful for. But I did still feel those same issues of a lack of diversity, especially in leadership. Really, no, there not being space. There might have been space for people of color on camera to, for what would be considered like a visual diversity. But behind the scenes, I did not feel like the diverse voices in the newsroom, mine included, were really valued. And after a while, that's what really led me to leave, to be honest.
And so after you left, where did you immediately start your own show? And did it impact the start of your show?
Yeah, so I actually left to take a job in tech. And so I did like a complete career pivot. And and I really at that time, I was really having a lot of mental health challenges. So I felt like I needed to step away to go to therapy, to give myself some time to heal. There were kind of a couple of more impactful incidents that happened. Like one of my coworkers accused me of bullying was kind of the main thing that happened. And like, this person was white. They were on a full-time contract. I was in a very precarious position on a short-term contract and was not given a chance to defend myself. And that situation really led to me having what you would call a mental breakdown. And so when I left, I really needed to take the time to take care of my mental health. And thankfully, I got this job in tech, which allowed me to do that and also to focus on taking care of myself. And about a year later is when I started to miss some aspects of journalism, but I knew I could never go back to traditional media. So that's when I decided to start my podcast. And really, I'd always been so drawn to people with incredible turning point stories and people who had overcome challenges. So that became the basis for the podcast. And I was really excited to be able to do something that was just on my own terms, where I didn't have to answer to anyone else. I could tell the stories I was passionate about.
Right. And I think it's really interesting. One of the things that you said, you said you felt this pressure to do super well and to work super hard, and it was something that was really bred within you, right? Like within your culture. I'm Mexican and Italian. I was also raised with that immigrant mindset. And I that really resonates with me because I had very similar experiences as well. I've spent 10 years in tech, but that was my experience. I always felt that I had to work so much harder than everybody else. And it was like it was just engraved in me, in my mind. I thought everybody else was doing the exact same thing, but I realized it wasn't. But what spoke to me about how it was, you mentioned too, it was you felt pressured. And it's interesting because is that pressure, sometimes I think how much of that is just due to my own intergenerational trauma, right? Where I look at, my family, they were immigrants and that was the pressure that maybe they felt. But how much of that is this system, this external system of society that we have created that is just this expectation of those of us who come from multi different backgrounds, that it's expected of us to work this way. And I'm just kind of curious, what your perspective is on that, what your experience has been. You have your show, and do you hear similar stories of that as well?
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, I think this is a very common feeling, even just among women in the workplace as well. Like you kind of always feel like you're the underdog, and if you are ambitious and you do have that desire to succeed, whatever that means to you, then you're often just always looking to the next thing, and the pressure I think comes from inside, and then also like you talked about that intergenerational pressure, if you have parents or grandparents who immigrated here, there's that pressure of like, okay, make sure, that we made the right decision for you. And like the way you show us that is by finding success. And I don't even feel like it was overtly said to me that way all the time, but you just know
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of the expectation. And I do hear that from a lot of the guests I've had on my podcast as well. And it's interesting because I actually feel like this idea is what led me to realize how often I see women and people of color not sharing their experiences and really kind of like keeping their stories to themselves, because they're not thinking about reflecting. You're always thinking about what can I do to get to the next step.
Right, right. And so that's super interesting to me. This idea of story keeping versus storytelling. And it's true. It's very common that we see that. And I think part of it is, like you said, we're not even thinking about it. And the other part of it is like, is there space for these stories? And it's something that I really struggle with personally because I always think, when we look at the DEI movement and in the corporate field, obviously it's great, but what is the space that's being created there? I think because I mean, what I sometimes feel is like there's always everyone wants to sponsor the event, everybody wants to celebrate something, but what is there acknowledgement of why this is the way it is? And I think that is something personally that is sometimes missing, right? Because if we don't acknowledge, yeah, everybody wants to celebrate the event, everybody wants to sponsor the event, but we're creating this environment where we're like, we're going to celebrate you, but we're going to pretend nothing ever really happened. We're going to pretend the reason that this happened is not us. We're just going to celebrate you. We're going to throw money at you. But, but we're going to, everything else is just swept under the rug. And I think is that are we creating the right space for people to be able to tell their stories, or are we only creating a space that's only sharing certain stories, the ones that we want to hear because there are only certain events that will get sponsored, right? So I'm again curious like what you think about that and some of the dynamics, and if it's possible to maybe create this a different type of space for these conversations.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point. Everybody wants to have their brand attached to something positive and happy and exciting, right? And I think often the stories we're celebrating are the ones that have that sort of happy ending, right? We talk a lot about a VP whose family came here with nothing and they worked their way up, and we talk about that moment of success and celebration. And I think what I try to do and think about in my own work is, the people who need inspiration and who need hope are the people who are going through a tough time, are experiencing challenge. And a lot of times in these stories, we're kind of skipping over that stuff and getting to the happy part. And what I encourage the speakers I work with to do is to really dig into that challenge. What was it like for you? How did you feel? And also, like, let's talk about how you overcame it. But the people in the crowd, the people on your teams, if you're an executive, I mean, the people who are struggling, they're the ones who need to hear that. They need to hear that there are challenging times and they need to feel like they're not alone. I mean, I think for anyone here, if you think about the most challenging experience you had in your life, you're probably also going to correlate it with a time when you felt really alone, because it's really hard when you're going through a challenging experience, whether, anything, whether it's something personally with your family, or, whether it's infertility or losing a loved one. Those are times when, if you don't know anyone who's had the same experience, it's so easy to turn inward. But when you hear someone who's in a leadership role, or someone who you really look up to, talking about going through that, and getting through that and how they felt in that moment, you just feel so connected. And I think there's a lot of relief in realizing, you're not alone in having that challenging experience. So I think that's what's missing from a lot of these events, though, is really giving people space to talk about those challenges, and space without consequence too, right? Because
Mm.
if you're up for a promotion and you had a bad experience on a team with a manager there, I mean, it's not something you really want to be talking about in a corporate environment. So yeah, I think you're really hitting on something key there. Like, how do we make space, a safe space for people to talk about those experiences?
Right. Yeah, that's and I'm really grateful that you said that, because that's exactly it. Like sometimes it's like, well, let's all create a space to share challenges, but are all challenges welcome here? Do you know what I mean? And then that's kind of what you're saying at the end, right? It's like, if there's a space, but if there's that contingency, right? There's like, well, there could be a consequence for you. Is that true space? And then how do we actually create a change in our society that doesn't thrive off of inequality, right? Like we keep it's sometimes I feel like you're like on an escalator going up, but the escalator is moving down. That's sometimes how it feels. It's like we're like striving and pushing for equality, but like the entire system is based off of inequality. And it's because we haven't created these spaces for these honest conversations to actually acknowledge why the system is like this. Because we just want to sponsor, we want to celebrate, but we don't want to have that real conversation. And I think we do want to, but that real conversation isn't always allowed because of who's behind it, right? Who's in power, really, right? Is really what it's all gonna come down to, I think.
Absolutely. I think after I left journalism, I really turned inward. I didn't talk to anyone about the racism I experienced, the discrimination, the sexism. I kept it all to myself. And at that time, I thought to myself, I will never talk about this. I just want to move on. I want to like put this away, never want to think about it again. And then I had all of these young journalists who started reaching out to me like, hey, I'm just getting started. I would love some career advice. And I remember thinking, like, how am I going to talk to these young journalists and encourage them when I have like such a negative opinion of this industry? But I also think, journalism is such important work, and I do feel like it's so important and connected to democracy. So what I realized, though, is that if someone had had that real talk conversation with me at the beginning, I would have been more prepared. So I did meet with these journalists, and a lot of them were young women of color. And I was honest with them. I said, it's not easy. And, chances are you will experience sexism, you will experience racism along the way. But what really helped me at certain points, and it was later in my career, was I met other people who were like me. So other women of color. And, if you belong to another underrepresented group, people who are part of that same group, and we connected, we shared our stories, we supported each other. So that's always my advice to them. And also, your voices are stronger together, right? I think we really saw this with the Me Too movement. A few women came out and started sharing their stories that they had kept to themselves for so long. And all of a sudden, they empowered other women to do the same thing. And then we actually saw some change happen. So I don't think it's easy. And I think sometimes it's just so small, and sharing your story with one person and helping that one person. And that's how it started for me. And then I shared my story on my own podcast. And then I had all of these female journalists reaching out to me, sharing their own stories with me. And so I think it isn't always big. It's not always like a big national story or a big conference where you're sharing it,
Hmm.
but I think those little opportunities to share those experiences and to find that kinship that exists between two people who've gone through the same challenge, I think there's a lot of power in that too.
That is fantastic, 100%. And I really think those words need to sink in for a minute because it's true. It is just sharing those little stories. And I mean, I think even if we look at historically, that is the root of a lot of cultures, right? A lot of cultures are based off of storytelling, and that's how we keep those cultures alive. And sometimes in this structure of society, we don't always get to do that and to feel that. And so it really does come down to each of us individually. And that does create that sort of collective power, right? I mean, to be empowered, I think, is really about being in our power, not in power, but in our power, right? And that's really what we talk about here on the show. We're talking about how we can stay in our power and create a system that's a little bit more socially conscious. And it really does always come down to us and the stories that we can tell to help each other out. Um, yeah, I mean, thank you so much. I think that that's where I think we need to go, and always turning inward, really being human to ourselves, being human to each other, and being human to the world. That is how we can make a difference. So, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Everyone who's listening, the wonderful Priya Sam, make sure you check out her show. Actually, I think you just had a news anchor on your show, correct? Just like a week ago, maybe?
Yes, I did. Yeah,
Yeah.
and she really shared an incredible story about her own mental health journey as well.
Yeah, I saw it, and I remember, and it did sound like a very, very authentic conversation. So make sure you check that, everybody. If you want her wonderful expertise in telling stories, obviously is something that she can really, really help you out with and really help create your stories and share them. So please make sure to check out our website. And if you're interested, you can also check out my website slash the Being Human Foundation for a few of our workshops coming up on intentional leadership and building social consciousness. So thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Thank you, Priya. I will chat with you soon,
All
wherever
right.
you are, and somewhere exciting.
I love it. Thanks so much for having me,
Thank
Vanessa, and for the great conversation. I really appreciate it.
thank you so much. Take care.